This episode is brought to you by Homes for Our Troops, a nonprofit helping build and donate homes to injured post 9/11 veterans. Visit hfotusa.org for more information. I'm Rod Rodriguez.
I'm Jack Murphy.
This is Military Matters. If you listen to Military Matters, you probably listen to other podcasts related to the military, DoD, the veteran genre, which is great because in this episode, we're introducing you to another podcast that I think you're going to want to listen to. It's an NPR investigative series from the Embedded podcast called Taking Cover. It's about the worst Marine-on-Marine friendly fire incident in modern history. It's also about the families that were lied to, reports that just went missing, and how the real story behind this deadly incident sent military leaders and political officials to finding their own cover. I talked with NPR Investigations senior producer Graham Smith and NPR Pentagon reporter Tom Bowman about how the story behind Taking Cover saw the light of day and how it was buried in the first place.
Well, I got a tip 3 years ago from a pretty good source telling me about a friendly fire that was covered up in Iraq during the first Battle of Fallujah in April of 2004. And the reason it was covered up was because the son of a prominent politician was involved in the screw-up.
That's Pentagon reporter Tom Bowman.
And they basically just buried this whole thing. And in journalism circles, we say sometimes things are almost too good to check. It's like, oh, that can't be right. And he said, no, it's true. And one Marine was killed, one was wounded. And I went to talk with Graham about it because I was still covering the Pentagon at that time and still am covering the Pentagon. I was doing some Chinese balloon stories today. So I couldn't spend all my time digging into this. So I went to Graham, who we worked with many times over the years, and told him about the tip. And we both started looking into it. First of all, how many were there any friendly fires during the first Battle of Fallujah? We went through small town obits. We Googled. We looked at how many friendly fires there were in Iraq, and there were only a couple that were well known and well reported, but nothing about friendly fire during the first Battle of Fallujah in April of 2004. And then Graham, he can pick it up from there. Then he found a mention of these two guys killed by friendly fire at a congressional hearing 3 years after the fact.
Yeah, it was weird, right? Because this doesn't show up anywhere in the record. I mean, I hope at some point in the course of our podcast it'll start to show up.
NPR senior producer Graham Smith.
But then they're the, hero pages, sort of like memorial pages for guys. And we noticed on one of them that these two guys who had been listed as, dying from hostile fire elsewhere, it had a note that it was friendly fire. And then the comments were like pretty emotional. A couple of people who were pretty worked up about, that it wasn't right what happened. And so, we finally started tracking guys down, finding people, finding corpsmen, finding the Marines, and hearing all of these stories from all these guys. Nobody had the complete picture, and there were a lot of rumors flying around that it was friendly fire and that some people knew it was because they had talked to the radio operator or this or that. But everybody had a different take on it. So we really started, just gathering all these stories and seeing where we could pin it down until finally we started being able to unearth documents underneath it. And for sure, this thing just disappeared. I mean, there was an investigation, but the investigation wasn't shared with the guys who were wounded, right? So guys who have Purple Hearts telling us, NPR reporters, we're the first person to tell them that there was actually an investigation. The families ultimately were told 3 years later because of follow-up investigations on Capitol Hill into the Pat Tillman case that forced the Marines to kind of finally acknowledge this, but they didn't then roll it out as robustly as they should have. And when we FOIA'd the Marines to get a copy of this 15-6 Jagman investigation ourselves, what they wrote back and told us was, We don't have it. We don't have any paperwork relating to any friendly fires in Fallujah 1. So it was just like, that's very strange.
So it just made no sense. As you know, serving in the military, they investigate everything. And the fact that you could have, as it turned out, 2 dead, 2 Marines dead, an Iraqi interpreter killed, and a dozen wounded, and they can't find the investigation was just crazy. So eventually we did get a copy of the investigation from one of the family members of Robert Zurheide, who was one of the Marines killed. And they were given the investigative report 3 years later. And we got a copy of the report from the family, started going through it, and then started to get a better sense of exactly what happened. That this 81 millimeter mortar mistakenly dropped in a schoolhouse in Fallujah and killed the Marines, the interpreter, wounded the others, and that 2 lieutenants who were involved in this were recommended for disciplinary action. It was kicked up to the regimental commander, who recommended the battalion commander also be punished as well, disciplined. And the regimental commander's boss brushed it all aside, say there will be no punishments at all. It was a fog of war, the heat of battle, everybody was tired and so forth. And that was someone named James Mattis who brushed aside all the recommended punishments.
I want to go back for a moment here. As you get this tip, Tom, it sounds like a Tom Clancy plot.
Exactly. That's why I say it was almost too good to check. It was just, you got to be kidding me. This clearly someone would have written about this, or there, would have been many investigations, congressional hearings. We definitely would have heard about this over the years, and turns out it was buried. There's absolutely no question.
Now, I want to ask you both before we get a little too further into this. When on Military Matters, we've talked about cover-ups. We've talked about we covered the Vanessa Guillen case in Fort Hood. We've talked just recently about drugs, death, and special operations right there on Fort Bragg. When it comes to cover-ups, having covered the Pentagon and numerous other stories, I'd like to hear your thoughts on why do we continue to play the cover-up game, knowing full well it almost always comes out in the wash and you never look better for it.
I'm just stunned that people would be so stupid as to cover up certain incidents. But again, I've been covering the military 25 years. They cover up everything. And you hate to sound cynical about it, but it does happen. I was covering the Pentagon when the Pat Tillman story broke. And I was astounded. It's like, first of all, how could you morally lie to the family about how their son or brother died? And then you think you can cover it up and no one's going to find out about it. Everybody knew instantly that Pat Tillman was killed by friendly fire. A fellow ranger was standing next to him. And the same thing happened in our case, where they knew instantly it was friendly fire. So it's just astounding that people continue to cover things up and think they're going to get away with it.
But, an interesting thing about the Tillman case vis-a-vis this case, right, is this happened on the 12th of April in 2004, which is a very bad month, right? Sadr, the whole, Mehdi army starts uprising in the south, which had been kind of calm. Fallujah's going off, big time. 10 days later, Pat Tillman is killed in Afghanistan. Still April 2004. And then at the end of the month, Abu Ghraib breaks. It was a terrible month, headed towards handing the country back to the Iraqis in June of that year and heading into the fall U.S. election season.
Where President Bush, the main issue obviously in the campaign would be Iraq, which wasn't going well clearly at the time. And Bush admitted at a press conference April 13th of 2004, this has been a bad few weeks in Iraq.
So I mean, they're right concurrent, right? So everything that's a factor in why they wouldn't want the Tillman thing to come to light is also a factor here. But the funny thing is, with Tillman, he was a super famous guy, probably the most famous soldier in the entire army at that point, right? NFL star, drops everything to go in after 9/11. it's sort of the exact opposite in our case, because like in the words of the widow who gave us the copy of this thing, she was like, it's like we were nobodies. And Tillman was a big guy. They want to cover it. Here, one of the people who was involved in the screw up in the fire support center, the politician's son, was Duncan Hunter Jr. His father at the time was the chair of the House Armed Services Committee. So he's not a criminal. I mean, nobody's saying that this was done on purpose, and I'm sure everybody involved in the screw up is devastated. But at the same time, with all this stuff going on, it seems like it was more about let's protect from the blowback because a powerful person, a connected person, is on the sort of screw up end of things versus a very famous person is on the receiving end and getting killed by it. So I'll close the loop on that. The funny thing that happens is they bury this thing, right? This goes away, doesn't get properly. Families aren't informed. Guys aren't informed. That sort of report doesn't get sent out for everybody to learn lessons from the way it's supposed to be. But then in 2007, 3 years later, after the DOD IG report comes out on Tillman in March of 2007, they have hearings on the Hill where all of the different branches are supposed to come to talk about their procedures for notification, all this stuff. It's only because of those hearings that came out of the Tillman experience that the Marines are finally forced to acknowledge that this friendly fire had happened.
But here's the thing. It took 2 hearings. The first hearing was by a general by the name of Mike Downs, and he said, we only have these 2 friendly fire incidents that were very well known. What they didn't know was that the Hill already knew the Marines weren't being forthcoming, that there were other friendly fires. They made them come back, and the second in command for the Marines, the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, a general by the name of Bob Magnus, finally admits publicly for the first time, we had this friendly fire in Fallujah 3 years ago that killed Brad Shooter and Rob Zerhide for the first time. And again, 2 hearings before they finally told the truth. So here we have a situation. We just laid the cards out. Okay, the families were told it was hostile fire. Not true. Families were never told an investigation had started, as they're supposed to. Never told the investigation came to an end when they're supposed to get a copy of the report from the Marines. So fast forward 3 years, and again, as Graham said, if it had not been for Pat Tillman's death and for his mother, Danny, pushing this so hard, forcing hearings on the Hill, the families to this day and the wounded probably would not have known the truth.
The military part of me wants to say, well, this is a general looking out for his Marines. He wants to do the right thing by them, and he wants to protect Marines who he understands these guys are probably torn apart. These guys are probably beside themselves. There's nobody that's on a force on force, on a blue on blue that is okay with it. In fact, my co-host Jack Murphy was involved in a blue on blue shooting in Afghanistan that he takes full responsibility for, and he talks about in his book. Did you feel that this cover-up came from a good place in Mattis's heart, or is this something that got out of control?
Well, we're not blaming it on Mattis. And by the way, he declined to talk with us about this and just said, you can look at my written comments in the report. We're not blaming it on Mattis. We're not pointing the finger at anyone, but clearly the Marine Corps hierarchy, we believe, based on the evidence we've put together, buried this thing. How else do you explain it? Particularly, again, when they had 2 hearings on the Hill, it took the second hearing for them to finally admit that we had this friendly fire incident, that you're not going to find in any Google search, you're not going to find in any histories of the war, any of the news reports at the time. And as one retired general told us, they should be teaching this at the schools, that these kinds of mistakes can happen so it doesn't happen again. And we went down to Quantico where they're shooting off 81 millimeter mortars, talked to these young lieutenants. They said, no, never heard of this.
And Brian, I'd just add that, I hear what you're saying about, like maybe they were coming from a good place kind of thing. But like, there is a sort of hubris, right, that comes into play where these folks, especially at the higher ranks, feel like they can make decisions about other people's lives, other people's rights to know about the way that their loved ones died, and that they're just going to decide for them that it's better for them not to know the truth. And every single person we've talked to, from Danny Tillman, right, Pat's mom, who we sat down with out in California, to the widow of one of these guys, they say, look, we want to know the truth. We deserve to know the truth. And not only that, the rules and procedures say that they have to know the truth. So I don't care what kind of like self-justification these guys are doing. It's honestly not their decision to make.
It's interesting because you both mentioned a lessons learned. So whenever there is a friendly fire incident or an accident, even there's always, this gets sent up to, I think for the Army, it's the Center for Army Lessons Learned call. The Marines have something very similar to that as well. Everybody has a lessons learned thing. And I wonder if the Vanessa Guillen case, the Pat Tillman case, this case, and every other situation where the Pentagon or the Department of Defense has been involved in a cover-up of any sort, if these are becoming lessons learned for future battlefield commanders, where it's like, hey, to your point, Graham, if this happens on your watch, you are not the arbitrator of the truth. You have to send this up no matter who's involved, how it's involved, or what happened. You got to do the right thing because it's going to come out, man. There's a Graham Smith, there's a Tom Bowman who are going to get a tip, and it's going to come out.
And if it doesn't come out, the other side of that is you have a whole lot of people with a whole lot of questions and a hole in their heart, right? And doubt about whether, a betrayal of the trust that they put in the military to be straight with them, right? We're going to go, our family's in harm's way, but you guys, we're part of the family and you're going to be straight with us. And it's that betrayal, beyond the fact that you might get caught, the fact that these people have to live in a limbo where they don't know they just know something weird happened.
And again, they told us, all these folks, Danny Tillman said, we can handle the truth. We just want the truth. And it's not your role to basically just give us a story. And one of the generals we spoke with, retired General John Tulin, retired as a 3-star, he said, you can't break the bonds of trust with the families. He said, your instincts are right. These questions have to be answered. And that's what we're trying to do in this podcast.
Tell me about the young men who were involved in this friendly fire incident. What was their state of mind? I mean, you were involved in a friendly fire. It's being covered up. I mean, there's no, it's happening. It's happening around you, especially when no one's talking about it. You probably feel like, I'm going to go in front of the man. I'm going to have to face some, I'm going to have to face the music, and there is no music. The band stopped playing and they've given you your PCS orders and you're off to your next duty station. Take me into that world of being on the other side of the cover up.
I think that sure, the guys who are the, first lieutenants in the fire support center, I can't imagine what's inside their head. They were not up for talking with us, although we reached out to both of these junior officers. They were very junior officers who were sort of sitting in for the folks who would normally do those jobs. One was out on a cordon and knock, the other was doing frag orders. So somehow you ended up with one guy and then another guy in training, like doing jobs that were a lot anyhow, and after 9 days of heavy combat. So for sure, it was confusing and people were tired. I can't say how they would have felt about it, except I'm sure that they felt terrible. I can say for the guys a lot of whom we spoke with, who were in the receiving end of it in the schoolhouse, the rumors went around. Some of the guys who were least informed are the ones who had to be evacuated right back to Germany and who ended up medically retired because they got shot out of there unconscious before everybody started to get their heads around it. But the guys on the ground have all traded these rumors for years and without knowing what the heck had happened. So that's been a very powerful piece of this reporting, is once we finally got the super redacted reports and then started to fill in the blanks and then pushed it back, back up the feedback loop. These guys never got the story from the Marines. We're gonna share the report with them And it's been really important to sit down with them and talk with them about what they get out of it. And as you know, these are not old men telling old war stories. These guys aren't even 40 years old. And yet this country, which really wasn't that plugged into the war in many ways at the time and went about their business, largely like to forget about it as like kind of something bad, and maybe it didn't work out the way we thought, and like let's not think so much about that. So I think it's very important, 20 years later, to come back and take a look at one specific instance, but in the larger context of like, hey, remember that Iraq War thing? What was that about?
And one of the most painful interviews I think we had was with one Marine, and we asked him, when did you first learn it was friendly fire? He said, about 2 minutes ago when you guys first raised it. And he said, the Purple Heart I got just doesn't mean as much anymore. And I think that really hit both of us. That was really hard.
That's actually part of my next question is, as you were doing this investigation, Graham, you hit on a point here about trust. Every service member, we say this oath to defend our country against enemies, foreign and domestic. There's no part of this oath that says, I will trust anybody. It's, I will obey these people. The people above me, the people who have been set to supervise me and have these legal precedences to essentially choose, what I'm going to do and order me. As you were talking to these Marines and family members, did you feel that trust being broken as you kind of like broke the news to them? Or did you feel like there was any type of like, well, this was a bad thing, but I still trust the people above. I still trust those folks. Tell me about that trust factor when it comes to the folks that you were talking to.
I got to tell you, I think some of the Marines and the family members have lost trust in the Marine Corps, and rightly so. One of the Marines we spoke with, he basically said they just don't care. And there's bitterness now with some of these people, with family members, that they were lied to. And again, rightly so, that they weren't told the truth. And again, we're still not getting any answers from the officers we spoke with up the chain of command. Mattis declined to talk with us. General Conway, his boss at the time, basically told us, after we reached out to him through emails and phone calls and so forth, we finally went to his house in Annapolis and said, I want to ask, with a letter with questions about the incident. We said, we want to talk with you about this. And he told us, I can't remember that. I'd have to look into it. And we're thinking, you can't remember this? What we were told was the worst Marine-on-Marine friendly fire in decades, and you can't remember it. And he said he'd talk with us. He never did. And he basically sent a statement to us saying, once the Marines discovered that this was, the families weren't told, they immediately corrected it. What he didn't say was they corrected it after 2 hearings, and it was forced on them by Danny Tillman, Pat Tillman's mother, forcing all the services to come up to the Hill and be, truthful and honest about their friendly fires.
I also think, Rob, I mean, you're a warrant officer. You're in for over 20 years. You were there early in Iraq, and I think, not just on this incident, but some of the guys we've talked to, are, something like a 20-year anniversary. It might not mean that much to Joe Public, but it means a lot to these guys, right? It means a lot to guys who've lost friends or who've been wounded, or, who did things when they were over there, whether they were justified or not, that really can weigh very heavily on your soul, right? And so I think a lot of these folks were very thoughtful about their experience at war and what it did to their, we had one guy who was a corpsman, Ben Leota, who said, my soul took more damage than anything else over there. And I had a really hard time, finding a way to really have a meaningful spiritual existence after that. I came back and people are like, oh, God sent his angels to look out for you. And he's like, and I'm sitting there like, I don't think it works like that. I don't think he saved me. I don't think God killed my friend Brad Shooter. Like everything in his, psyche got kind of scrambled up. And he said it took him really a long time to kind of bring himself back in from that. And it's not directly at your question about sort of trust, but it kind of is in a way, because I think you're right. folks who serve in the armed forces sign up to go do the things that they're asked to do, and they get it. They follow orders. They try to do the best job and be professional that they are. But then ultimately, when they muster out and they got a family and they're looking back on this stuff and they're trying to make sense of it all, it can be very challenging, I think, for a lot of folks to figure out how it all makes sense. And, did they do, what did that mean? That thing I did with my best friends in the world when I was 20 years old, like, how do I get my head around it now?
Homes for Our Troops, HFOT, is a publicly funded nonprofit organization that builds and donates specially adapted custom homes nationwide for severely injured post 9/11 veterans to enable them to rebuild their lives. These homes restore some of the freedom and independence our veterans sacrificed while defending our country. Nearly 90 cents out of every dollar spent has gone directly to supporting our veterans and enabling them to rebuild their lives. Visit hfotusa.org. That's hfotusa.org to learn more. Tom, you mentioned that you asked for these interviews with these generals and with these high-ranking officials and people that were there in certain positions, and you got crickets. I'm not surprised. I don't think anybody that's ever worked in the DoD is surprised by that. But my question is, what part of the story do you feel that they have that you need for your story? What are we looking for from some of these folks? Do we want acknowledgement? Do we want an apology? Is there a part of the story that we don't know yet that they may or may not have when we talk to some of these folks that are simply just stonewalling you?
Well, again, the tip I got was this was all covered up because one of the people involved in the mistaken friendly fire was a Marine lieutenant named Duncan Hunter Jr., and his dad was chairman of the Armed Services Committee. That was the tip. So would anyone come forward and say, okay, that's what happened. We covered it up because of Duncan Hunter Jr. We have not received that from anybody yet. And again, some of these generals don't want to talk or send brief statements. But remember, Pat Tillman's family, everybody agrees it was a cover-up. Even Duncan Hunter, the dad, agrees, yeah, Pat Tillman was covered up. But, in this case, they got no explanation about why it was mishandled. Some people say it was just fell through the cracks. It was sort of a bureaucratic problem. At least Pat Tillman's family got an apology. These families to this day have not received an apology.
And I think there is an accountability piece. And the folks who were in power at that time are almost all retired. I mean, a couple folks did talk with us. Greg Olson, who was the battalion commander at the time, he's now a 3-star, sat down, talked it through with us. Jocko Tulin, who was a colonel, he was the regimental commander at the time, gave us a lot of time. It was very thoughtful. But the folks higher than that have retired out. And so I guess the question is, how do they handle it? How do they handle the fact, right, that you've got guys who were medically retired as a result of wounds? This guy, John Smith, lost a leg, lost the use of one of his eyes. To this day, has not had somebody visit him and say, here's a copy of the report. I'm here to answer your questions. You deserve the truth. To this day, still hasn't happened. And he's not hard to find, right? Dude was going to college on Camp Pendleton Base. So, I mean, I think there is some sense of like, maybe you all can try to make this right. I think as Tom said, I mean, we're not expecting somebody to come out and say like, here's the paper where I signed it and said, bury this thing. Even the Tillmans didn't get the satisfaction of being able to like hold it up.
So again, getting back to the original tip, it was all covered up because of Duncan Hunter. And so we went, and there are two Duncan Hunters, as the dad runs the Armed Services Committee and the kid who was a Marine lieutenant in the Operations Center when they called in the mistaken mortar. He was plotting it on a map, and apparently he pointed to the wrong target, which started this whole ball rolling, which ended in a mortar 81 millimeter floating into the courtyard. So what do we do, as any reporter would do? Well, let's go talk to the old man first, who was retired and was chairman of the Armed Services Committee, who, by the way, wrote a book called Victory in Iraq. Great detail about the first Battle of Fallujah, including the fact that his son called after they announced a ceasefire. He said, all you politicians are idiots. We could win this thing. We could push through the city. Why are we stopping now? And so we asked the Duncan Sr., well, what about what happened on April 12, 2004? He said, what are you talking about? We said, the friendly fire incident. He said, what friendly fire incident? And I've been doing this job a long time, and I can tell when someone's lying. This guy was not lying, I don't think. And he said he didn't know anything about it. I said, your son never mentioned it? He said, no. And then we finally tracked down Duncan Jr., again, after reaching out to him through intermediaries for months. We caught up to him in San Diego and tried to ask him about this. And he said, oh, the Marine Corps investigated this. And we said, well, what about your involvement? And he said, listen, I was an artillery officer, which is technically correct, but he was in the operations center. He plotted this on a map. He pointed to the wrong target when then Lieutenant Colonel Greg Olson walked in and said, what's going on? And the lieutenant next to him said, oh, that target it's 400 meters away from friendly forces. And then Olson ordered the mortar mission, and that's what happened.
I was just going to, just one other thing there, which is, Tom and I think we're working on this together. We've been working together for a long time, but we don't always come to the same conclusions. Like, I'm a little more skeptical of Hunter Sr. And honestly, there's some work for a listener to do. And I hope that that's part of the enjoyment of listening to the show is we've talked to a lot of different people who have a lot of different views. And sometimes there's, like connecting of the dots that you really can only do inside your head. Like, how does this make sense? Because a lot of it doesn't make any sense. And we'll give you what we've learned. We'll give you what makes the most sense to us. But, different people, and yourself included, who've been there, who've had families involved, or who just like a good mystery, have some work to do to like figure out what the heck was going on here.
I've heard of other situations very similar to this where I believe there was another situation in Iraq where it was a cover-up of a unit that a couple of guys in the unit that were involved in a murder of an Iraqi family. I've heard folks being approached with non-disclosure agreements. I've heard of folks being straight up told, if you say something, X, Y, and Z will happen to you. Did you find any levels of coercion or threats to people to keep this under wraps?
Well, Greg Olson and others were told not to say anything about it because there's an ongoing friendly fire investigation. But nobody was ever coerced as far as we know. It was all the investigation still going on, so don't say anything. And that kind of happened in the Pat Tillman incident, too. People were told not to say anything. But again, in Tillman's case, in our case, once the investigation's over, you're supposed to tell the families.
Although, in the case of one Marine we talked with who was medically retired because of this, name is David Costello. He was one of the few people who did get a visit 3 years later. And he said that the JAG, that the JAG who came out, a colonel from Pendleton, told him, look, here's the deal. Here's the papers we're giving you. Don't talk about this.
And actually, I just remembered Chris Covington, who he knew it was friendly fire while the investigations were going on. He went to the wife of one of the Marines who died and said, we think it's friendly fire, suspected friendly fire. And he got in a lot of trouble when he came back from his superiors. Don't say anything about it.
Together, you've covered it sounds like you've both covered the entirety of the war on quote unquote terror. And you've seen this case, 2004, Tillman, and there are countless other situations out there where I'm sure folks are sitting on a bomb, for lack of a better word, a bombshell, if you will. After this story, walking away from it, reflecting on what you covered, How do you feel about these last 20 years? Has your perspective on the DoD or the Department of Defense changed, or the military or its decisions? Uh, how did this story affect you personally?
I guess at a gut level, it really disturbed me that families were lied to, that how awful we have kids, how awful it is to lose someone, but how worse it is to lose someone and someone lies to you about how they died, especially serving their country. That just really grates at me. But also, our podcast is more than just about this friendly fire incident. It's against the backdrop of the Iraq War, the miscalculations, the mistakes, the lies in many cases that come through in this. So John Tulin, one of the generals we spoke with, he was in Fallujah, and he said, we didn't know who we were dealing with, who's in charge of the city. We didn't even know who we were fighting. What does that say about this war in Iraq and what was done, what was not done, and again, the mistakes that were made? And it gives, we spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan over the years, and just what we were told at the Pentagon, for example, that, hey, the Afghans are getting much better. They're leading patrols now. And I was at a combat outpost with the 101st. At dawn, we were ready to go out on a patrol. This is at a time when the Afghans are supposed to be leading the patrols. I'm standing next to this sergeant, and an Afghan soldier, half-dressed, walks up to him and says, he's smelling of hash, saying, hey, you have any milk? And the sergeant says, I don't have any damn milk. Get back and get your stuff on. You're leading the patrol. So the benefits of going to places like this and talking to guys on the ground, just in the case of this friendly fire, you get a better sense of what's really going on. And what's really disturbing is, again, the mistakes and miscalculations, the sugarcoating of these wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Things are getting better. We're making progress. It's just really distressing, really distressing.
I would just say that, it's been incredibly interesting. I, have been, covering since I was running All Things Considered when the war kicked off, and I didn't think much of Colin Powell's speech at the UN. I didn't think a lot of the stuff that was coming out of, DoD public relations for the whole time. I remember Tom and I were out one time in Wardak with SF guys, and they came back from being out on a thing, basically told us a story about what had happened, and then the next day a press release was put out that said a totally exact opposite story, that the Afghans had been in the lead doing all this stuff. And we called them and we're like, what's up? We got from the horse's mouth, this is not true. And they're like, meh, sticking with our story. So that I haven't had a lot of scales fall from my eyes over this process, but what has been very, very powerful is to sit with these guys and hear their stories. And I think a lot of them are stories that they haven't ever told anybody outside of like their brothers, right? Their friends that they were in combat with. And I think it's important, honestly, for people out in the world to hear these stories and to hear the real stories from the heart. That I think maybe just because Tom and I have been there, we haven't had the same experiences, but we've been in the neighborhood. It's important for people to hear these stories because I think it's really important that people understand what we are asking of people, these young men and women, when we send them to war. Because it's a big ask. And a lot of them don't have any idea, right, until it gets real, of what is really being asked of them. And they don't have an idea of what, it all meant for a long time. And I think people need to take it very, very seriously. When a decision has to be made, you send people off to war, because it's a big ask.
And I think it's important to note, as we all know, that less than 1% of people have someone serving in the military, are serving in the military, that it's gone are the days where there was a draft, where World War II, you'd put John Kennedy in with a bunch of working class guys in the Pacific. That's all gone now. It's all volunteer Army and Marines and Air Force. So it's important for the American people to know what these guys went through, as Graham said, in Iraq. The horrible situation, losing their faith, losing limbs, having PTSD 20 years later. And again, these guys are in their late 30s now, not even 40. So I think our podcast, offers a window into what these guys go through, and what the American people owe them, and frankly, what their leadership owes them. They don't deserve to be lied to by their leaders for whatever reason, whether it's an embarrassment or whether it's Duncan Hunter Jr. was involved in this incident, however, never cited. But it's important to tell the truth.
I was just talking with during another interview with another guest about history. And there's a quote that I really appreciate from Mark Twain. History doesn't always repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme, right? I look at the war on terror, and then I look at the headlines, the war in Ukraine with the Russians. It is a war that the United States is fighting by proxy, but it is a war that is very likely to pull us into it. There is a good chance in the future that our children will once again be called up into service. I tell folks all the time, I got skin in the game because I've got three. I got a Marine infantryman, an Army infantryman, and a Air Force airman. So with these next fights, my kids are going to go fight these wars. And as a journalist, hearing these stories like yours from 2004, then we have stories in 2010, then we have stories coming out about 2020. It just seems like we have this history of cover-ups and doing what's right for folks in leadership positions to keep those to turn their eagles into stars and stars into suits. Looking forward, what do you hope that your listeners, both civilians and maybe policymakers, what do you want them to get out of this, looking at future wars?
Well, I'm not sure about looking at future wars, but I can tell in this situation what these families deserve is an apology. The Tillman family got one. These families never got an apology. And the Iraqi interpreter, we went to see him and went to see his family. They were also lied to. They said their brother was killed by terrorists. They were given $9,000. So what is owed to them? More money, or one of the brothers wants to go to the United States. Do you help him out? But as far as the future, listen, there will always be war. There'll always be cover-ups, either because of embarrassment or someone's kid was involved in this and they don't want it to come to light. A friend of mine was a battalion commander in eastern Afghanistan, and a bunch of SF guys came in looking for Taliban. They ended up shooting up a bunch of Afghan border guards and killing them. And my friend said, we just paid off the families and no one ever knew about it. Imagine how often those kinds of things happen. And there are other incidents of, soldiers or Marines, pissing on corpses. A lot of that's been covered up as well. This will always go on. Maybe this is a wake-up call to maybe future generals and colonels that tell the truth, because if you don't, there's a good chance that some of this is going to come out, and then you have to do the right thing. Do you want to be forced to do the right thing?
Yeah, you touched, Rod, earlier on this idea. Like, there's two levels of lessons learned, right? For sure, it seems to me this would be a pretty good scenario to teach young lieutenants who are going to potentially work in a fire support center or call in fire close to their own troops, right? How do you do danger close? How do you make sure that you're very clear in your transmissions? How do you make sure that you're clear, right, and the communication within the COC is on point, right? But then there's this other level of, like, as leadership, how do you handle things? What's the right thing to do? What are the regulations? And here's some examples of how it can go wrong. You don't want to be that guy, right? We have these rules for a reason, and it's about treating people properly. It's the right thing to do. It's about the legal thing to do. And I hope, that people will listen to this, and maybe there'll be a few people, who maybe there'll be a few friendly fire cases that are handled better down the road.
I'm going to say one other thing, too, because some people will say to us, oh, it's NPR, you guys hate the military, you hate America, and all this other stuff. And actually, Duncan Hunter Sr. started kind of trashing NPR and saying, you guys don't do anything pro-America. And I stopped him and said, hang on a second. We spent a lot of time in Iraq and Afghanistan with Marines and soldiers, so let's just stop that right now. We tell all kinds of stories, warts and all, about heroism, about Medal of Honor recipients, about going on patrols with regular guys and talking with them, about trying to get to the truth. So, let's just back off on that kind of talk about it.
I think it's interesting because at Military Matters, we often get accused of being both left and right fanatics, which is really interesting because I'm always telling folks, oh, choose which is it? Because on one hand, we do a great story about the military. We're right-wing conservatives and we just, we're shills. I tell a story about deaths on Fort Bragg and special operations guys, and suddenly we're left-wing liberal psychos who hate the military. And I'm like, whatever, man. I wish I was getting the kickbacks that they said I was, because I wouldn't need this job.
Yeah.
Is there anything you guys want to talk about before we wrap this up that maybe you want to bring up to the audience? Maybe it'll entice them to listen to this a podcast a little more, but I just didn't want to give out too many of the hidden stuff and the moments,
I guess one of the interesting thing is our trip to Iraq to go see the family of the interpreter that was killed. And you get obviously a different perspective about the war in Iraq by talking to Iraqis. And we talked to the family, and they said the fact that their brother worked for the Americans, they've had to move 12 times since 2004. And to this day, they said, if you're going to come see us, come at night. We don't want anybody to see you coming into our house. The sectarian violence there is really, really bad. We were looking at it through Western eyes. Graham and I were walking all around Baghdad, never got a dirty look, never had any trouble. People were really friendly. We're like, wow, this place is great. You talk to the Iraqis, it's like, no, you guys ruined our country because of the sectarian violence. And then we talked to a couple of sheikhs out in Fallujah, right near that school where the friendly fire happened. And one of the guys said, you guys brought Al-Qaeda and ISIS to our country. They were never here before. You brought them here. So again, it was a different perspective after talking to Marines and generals and so forth and colonels to go talk to the Iraqis about how they see things 20 years later.
That sounds like there's a whole new story to talk about there. That's a story that has not been told. We often talk about the ramifications of these wars on American soldiers and American service members. We don't often talk about the effects that these wars have had on our partners, on the folks that are in those countries, the interpreters. You both gave a similar stories about the Afghan military, the Afghan soldiers. The regular army, unfortunately, was exactly what you're talking about. But there are countless stories of Afghan commandos who were working with those SF units and those Navy SEALs, those JSOC guys that were straight warriors. I mean, they were out there doing God's work, defending the country they legitimately believed in. The country, I hate to say we sold them on.
No, we went on a couple of missions with the Afghan commandos. They were absolutely terrific. The problem was they were too few in number. I think they had maybe 17,000. And I talked to one commander. He said, we're like firefighters. We go running around putting out brush fires because the rank and file Afghan soldiers can't do anything. And those guys were really, you're right, they're heroic guys, fought like hell for their country. And we were told by one of them when the whole thing came to an end, that Ghani told them, put down your weapons, don't fight. They wanted to keep fighting, and they were told, put down your weapons. And one last thing about the interpreters, we were sitting with one of these guys on the mall, National Mall, looking at the Capitol.
This is one of the PSYOP guys.
One of the Army PSYOP guys, by the way. And we were talking about the interpreter, and he said, there should be a statue somewhere, maybe down at Fort Bragg or Fort Benning, I guess Fort Bragg, to the interpreters that work with the Americans. I do believe they have a statue somewhere too, like working dogs that work with the U.S. military. But there is no a statue or any memorial to all those interpreters, like Shahab, this guy that worked with our Marines. It was an amazing trip doing this thing. You really feel it was something worthwhile. Looking back over my career, this is probably one of the top, achievements I think of my career, 30 plus years.
And I was just going to say on the maybe it's not to try to weave it in, but what's interesting is that this group of guys we've been talking with, 2-1 Marines out of San Diego, they came over like you, right, in 2003, came over from Kuwait on day one, and they lost a guy, Jose Gutierrez, to friendly fire. He had fallen a little behind and got zapped by an over-enthusiastic, set of guys behind him. Minutes into the invasion. You know who the guys were at the Kabul airport who had that bomb blow up? It was 2-1. Same unit. I mean, obviously not the same guys, but it's interesting that you can take a look at one moment, really one instant on one afternoon, on one day in 2004. But you take a look at it and you can kind of get a bigger sense of this last 20 years of war, right? It kind of hangs together as a piece. And so that's what's been so fascinating, I think, for both of us, is kind of you just keep seeing these reverberations. As you said, it kind of rhymes.
We often get the question of why do we talk about government cover-ups? There's the idea that talking about military wrongs is tantamount to being anti-military. Here's the thing. The military is a huge enterprise. And like any giant organization, there are always going to be amazing, talented people who are doing the right thing. And then there are folks who feel compelled to protect themselves and maybe even believe they're doing the right thing by protecting their organization by covering up the truth. But that is getting harder to do nowadays. Investigative journalists have new platforms like podcasts, where they can talk at length about stories like this one. And if anything, supporters of the military should look to stories like this as learning points for future generations of military leaders, as a message that time won't make things go away, that mistakes will happen, and we will have to own them, that transparency builds trust even when it means admitting failure and fault. The families of these Marines deserve the truth. The families of the service members, they put their trust in the military to do the right thing and to honor the lives of their children who volunteered to serve. When cover-ups are exposed, it causes us all to cast a doubting eye on the very institutions we want to trust. And it makes it harder to do so when we need to. I want to thank NPR's Graham Smith and Tom Bowman for taking time to talk with me about their podcast. I highly encourage you to go check out Taking Cover, a podcast from NPR. You can Google Taking Cover podcast, or you can check out the link in the show notes. Go to stripes.com, use promo code podcast, and save 50% on your digital subscription. Go to stripes.com today. Folks, that does it for me. I'm Rod Rodriguez, and I will see you at the next episode. This episode was brought to you by Homes for Our Troops, a nonprofit helping build and donate homes to injured post-9/11 veterans. Visit hfotusa.org for more information.